The year was 1883. Out along the southern stretch of Colorado, where the land ran flat and dry and the sky pressed down like a lid on a jar, there was a stretch of country people passed through but rarely stopped in. Dry Creek Territory, they called it, and the name suited the place well enough. The creek had given up years ago. What remained was dust and distance, and the kind of silence that settles in when a place has been holding its breath too long. Just north of the main road, where the fence posts leaned like old men tired of standing, sat High Hollow Ranch. It wasn't much to speak of. Timbers gone silver from the wind, a porch that groaned under boot heels, shutters that didn't close quite right, and a barn that listed slightly to one side, as if the whole structure had grown weary of the effort. The kitchen was cold more often than not. The parlor collected dust the way some rooms collect sunlight, and the man who lived there had not opened a window in longer than he could rightly say. His name was Boone Mercer, last of the Mercer line. His wife, Clara, had died 2 winters prior, along with the child she carried, a daughter who never drew breath, who never had the chance to make a sound in this world. Boone had buried them both beneath the cottonwood behind the house and then come inside and quietly let everything stop. He placed an advertisement in the Dry Creek Courier for a cook and housekeeper. Not because he cared much about eating, more because something in him, some animal instinct buried beneath the grief, understood that if something didn't change, the house would take him with it. The woman who answered that notice arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, before the sun had fully committed to the day. A wagon eased up the path slow and careful, and on the back of it sat a woman with worn boots, dark hair pinned plain, and a small ribbon of blue at her collar. Her eyes, when they found his, did not drop, did not ask permission. They simply held. Her name was Rebecca Wynn. She had no dowry, no people behind her, no letters of recommendation from houses that would speak well of her. What she had was steadiness, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind you only recognize once you've watched someone stand in a doorway and not flinch. Boone looked at her once, long enough to take her measure, and said in that gravel-worn voice of his, "You're the one answered the notice." She did not hesitate. "If the job's still open, yes. Kitchen's round back, side room's yours, water pumps by the well. Things are quiet here. Quiet suits me fine." That was all. No handshake, no smiles. Just 2 people standing on opposite sides of a threshold they'd both sealed shut from the inside years ago for different reasons. And as she passed him, her skirt brushed his coat for only a moment. You better believe that was enough, because Boone Mercer didn't know it yet. But the silence that had lived in that house since Clara's passing was about to learn a different kind of quiet. Not the kind that hollows a place out. The kind that comes when someone finally starts listening. This is their story. A tale of a woman the world had taken from and discarded, and the man who would discover, slowly, painfully, and without flourish, that healing doesn't announce itself. It just shows up and starts work before you're ready. Now, Rebecca Wynn was not a woman who wasted the early hours. Never had been. First full morning at High Hollow Ranch, she was up before the rooster, before the light, before the world had agreed it was time to begin. She lit the stove with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times, let the smell of coffee spread through rooms that hadn't held that smell in years, pulled bread from the oven and set it where the warmth from the fireplace could keep it good. She didn't make a production of it, just worked, the same way she always had. Boone came through the kitchen not long after, boots already on, hat in hand. He stopped when the smell hit him, looked at the coffee and the bread and then at her, gave one short nod. That was all. He sat on the porch long stretches of the day, staring at the middle distance like it might eventually offer up something useful. Some mornings he was out before dawn and not back until the stars had taken the sky. Other times he sat by the stove in the evenings with his boots still dusty from the trail and said nothing at all. Rebecca did not mind the silence. She had come to understand it. She had known men who used silence as a weapon, a held-out withholding, deliberate and cold. Boone's silence was not that. His was the quiet of a man who had used up his words on grief and not yet grown new ones. Before High Hollow there had been a house in Los Alamos. Large place, fine curtains, a man with smooth hands and sharper eyes who had hired her to cook. What he wanted, it turned out, was someone who wouldn't look away when he reached for her wrist. She had looked away. The next morning her things were on the porch, and he stood in the doorway with a sneer that he probably thought passed for contempt. "Women like you don't last," he said. She said nothing at all, just gathered her bundle and walked. Before that there was her mother during the war. Frail and coughing and cooking over ash, while Rebecca stirred thin broth and pretended not to see the blood on the rag her mama pressed to her lips when she thought the girl wasn't watching. One neighbor had left a bag of apples on the step with a folded note that read simply, "For your strength." It was the one act of kindness Rebecca could still call up clearly from that winter, which told you something about how the rest of it went. So yes, she'd made her peace with silence long ago, and Boone's particular version of it, heavy as it was, felt more familiar to her than dangerous, like stepping into a room where the air has been still for too long. You just open a window. You don't have to explain why. There was a dog on that ranch. Copper, they called him. Gray around the muzzle, ribs visible if you looked, eyes that had seen more than one hard winter. He paid Rebecca no mind for the first several days, ate when she put scraps near the porch, slept where he'd always slept, did not offer himself up. But one morning, while she was at the window kneading dough, humming a tune her mother had hummed over the same kind of work, Copper rose from his spot on the porch, padded inside, and sat himself down beside her feet. Did not look up, did not ask for anything, just settled. Boone was at the doorframe. He saw it happen, said nothing, but something shifted in his face, like a lock that had not yet been turned but had just been touched. They were 3 weeks into the arrangement when the rain came. It rolled in sudden from the hills the way Colorado storms do without the courtesy of warning. Rebecca had just gotten the washing on the line when the wind picked up and sent the whole thing sideways. Boone's shirts caught the gust and went flying. White flags scattered across the yard and into the tall grass beyond. She ran, skirts biting at her ankles, boots sinking in the soft ground. She went after them, grabbing at sleeves and collars, chasing them into the mud and the wet grass. She was reaching for the last one when her boot caught wrong and she went down hard, one hand in the mud, knee slamming into the earth. She was pushing herself up when a hand closed around hers. Boone. Rain on his face, coat already dark with water, one arm going around her elbow, the other snatching the shirt clean out of the air. "Didn't think you'd be out in this mess," he said. She was soaked, breathless, one knee throbbing. But she looked up at him and said, "Didn't want your clothes ending up in Santa Fe." And Boone Mercer smiled. Not a polite pulling of the lips. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere that hasn't been reached in a good long while. They walked back to the house in the rain, boots squelching in the mud. He handed her a towel at the door, said nothing more. She wrung out her hair and went back to the kitchen, and that night, shaping dough in the lamplight, she hummed that same quiet tune. Boone stood in the hallway watching from the shadows. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But his shoulders, which had been braced for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like not to be, had come down a little. The silence that night didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt like something waking up. Time had a different quality at High Hollow after that, not faster, not louder, but real, the way creek water is real when it finally starts running again after a cold snap. Rebecca kept at her work, not just the cooking, though the meals were good and regular and warm in a way the house had not known in some time. She tended, polished the windows until the light came through clean, scrubbed the floorboards down to their grain. Found a drawer in the kitchen that had been jammed for what looked like 5 winters and worked at it until it moved smooth. She said nothing about any of it, did not expect acknowledgement, but Boone noticed. He began staying in the kitchen longer, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe, watching her hands move, not saying much, but present the way a man is present when something has caught his attention that he doesn't quite know what to do with yet. One morning before she came down, she found a parcel on the kitchen table. Brown paper tied tight with twine. She opened it slow. Inside was a pair of shoes, leather, soft and fine, the kind that had been made to last, but also to be worn by someone who deserved better than cracked soles. She held them in her lap for a long time. That evening over supper, she looked at him steady and said, "Those shoes weren't by accident, were they?" Boone didn't quite meet her eye. Saw them in town. Figured they looked like they knew how to carry a woman who don't sit still. Rebecca turned the spoon in her hand. "They're finer than anything I've worked in." "Good," Boone said low. "They weren't meant for work." She didn't answer after that, but she wore them the next day. A few evenings later, she found something else placed on the edge of the supper table without explanation. A silver brooch shaped like a columbine in bloom. Small and careful and lovely in the way of something made with attention. No card, no word about it at all. Just the thing itself left where she would see it. Rebecca picked it up and turned it in her fingers for a long time, like it was too fine a thing to rush. She pinned it below her collar the following morning. Boone saw it at breakfast, said nothing. But something in his jaw eased, the way a man's does when a thing he was uncertain about has turned out to be all right. One afternoon, Boone came in from the field to find the parlor rearranged. Not dramatically. The chair had been moved 3 feet toward the window. The small side table stood where there had been nothing before. A strip of cloth had been laid across the back of the settee, covering a worn place in the fabric. He stood in the doorway and looked at it a long time. He didn't say a word about it. But the next morning there was a cord of new wood stacked beside the kitchen door, more than she'd asked for, more than the week required. She saw it when she stepped out to bring in water. Stood looking at it with the bucket in her hand. Neither of them mentioned it. That was how it went between them. No declarations, no explanations. Just the small and daily language of two people beginning to pay attention to each other's needs without making a performance of it. He started reading in the evenings. Books she hadn't known were in the house, pulled from a shelf in the back room where they'd been sitting undisturbed. He read slowly, stopping sometimes to work out a line that wasn't going the way he expected. "The hell's a metaphor supposed to mean anyway?" he grumbled one night. "It means you're supposed to feel it more than understand it," she said without looking up from her mending. "Sounds like a trick." "Sometimes it is." She smiled at the hem she was working. He turned the page. Then came the evening. He showed her the drawing. He brought it out after supper when the fire was low and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. A piece of paper, worn soft at the folds from being handled many times. On it in crayon 2 stick figures stood in front of a lopsided house with flowers drawn out front. "Clara drew it," he said, "right after she told me we were expecting." He looked at the fire instead of the drawing. "After she died, I put it away. Couldn't stand to look at what never came." His voice had gone tight, not breaking. Just tight the way a seam goes before it gives. Rebecca held the paper with both hands and traced the crayon lines with her thumb. "It's still growing, Boone," she said, quiet and certain. "You just planted it different." Boone didn't answer, but something in the house, something in the old wood of it, seemed to breathe out, like it had been waiting years for someone to say exactly that. Trouble doesn't always ride in loud. Sometimes it comes folded up inside an envelope and sets itself on your table like it belongs there. Boone came back from town one afternoon with dust on his boots and a letter he hadn't asked for. He laid it on the table without a word. In the afternoon light it looked like a warning, which is exactly what it was. Rebecca read it through twice, careful. The name at the top was Roland Haynes. He had been Clara's brother-in-law in name only, a man who had shown his face twice in the years before her passing and not once since. But now he had things to say, legal things. He claimed Clara had left him a share of High Hollow Ranch. He claimed the right was documented. He was coming to collect what was his. Boone stood behind her, jaw set. Never saw a word from that man after she passed. Now he wants a piece of this. Rebecca ran her finger along the bottom of the page, slowly. Then she held it toward the window. The handwriting's off, she said. Seal's wrong, and the date is 2 weeks after she died. Boone went still. I worked for a lawyer once, she said. Filed half his town records while he drank his lunch. I know what a real document looks like. She set the letter down flat on the table. This isn't one. Next morning, Boone rode to Dry Creek and put the letter in front of Charlie Merritt, a man who'd been practicing law in that county for 20 years and was known for being more interested in what was true than what was convenient. Charlie read it once, then again, then set it down and leaned back in his chair. This is a forgery, he said. Sloppy one, too. Seal don't match the county stamp by half an inch. Ink hasn't settled right on the date. Whoever flagged this caught him clean. That was her, Boone said. Charlie looked at him for a moment, then out the window, then back. She's sharp, Boone. You better hold on to that one. That night, Boone stood outside the barn under a sky thick with stars and thought about losing. He had already lost once, and he knew the exact dimensions of that kind of empty. What was different now was that someone else was inside the house. The lights were on, and the thought of it going dark again sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't put down. A week passed. Then Roland came. He rode in on a bright morning with 2 men behind him, the kind of men who wear too much leather and not enough expression. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who expected to be given what he asked for. Boone was on the porch. Rebecca stood beside him, still as a post. Roland dismounted with a grin that did not reach his eyes. Still clinging to your claim, Boone? Funny thing about grief, makes a man sloppy. Boone said nothing. Roland's eye slid to Rebecca. Didn't realize the help spoke for the land now. Rebecca took 1 step forward. Funny, neither did the land, until someone started tending it. Roland's grin thinned. He looked back at Boone. You've let a woman talk for your ranch, cousin. Clara would be ashamed. Boone's voice, when it came, was quiet and final. She ain't help. She's the reason this place has breath again. And that was when Charlie Merritt rode up the trail behind Roland, papers in hand, a county marshal at his side. He held the documents up so they caught the morning light. Courts reviewed the document you submitted, Mr. Haynes. The ruling is clear. Forgery. No claim, no rights, no standing on this property. He looked past Roland to the 2 riders. Unless any of you would like to be charged alongside him, I'd recommend you turn those horses around. Roland held still a long moment, looked at Boone, looked at Rebecca with something that might have been calculation or might have been pure anger, found no opening in either face. He swung back into the saddle and rode off without another word. His men followed. Boone let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. He turned to Rebecca. The words came out low and not quite even. You saved this place. She took his hand and held it. No, Boone, she said. We did. The land looked no different that morning. But it felt different. The way a thing feels when it's been defended, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. A few weeks after Roland's boots left their last mark on the road, Boone came downstairs on a Sunday morning in a clean shirt, moving with the careful energy of a man who had made a decision and was still getting used to it. He stood in the kitchen doorway, thumb hooked in his belt. There's a church picnic today, he said. I thought maybe we could go. Rebecca turned from the stove, wiped her hands on her apron. You haven't set foot at one of those in years. Maybe that's the reason I should. She nodded once. All right then, let's go. She wore her blue dress, the one with the careful patch at the left hem that you only noticed if you were looking for it. She pinned the columbine brooch below her collar and tied her hair back with the same ribbon she'd worn the morning she arrived. Boone hitched the wagon without ceremony, and they rode into Dry Creek, side by side, the way 2 people do when they've stopped pretending there's nothing between them. People noticed. they noticed Boone Mercer, quiet Boone, riding tall beside a woman who was not his wife, but carried herself like someone who knew where she belonged. The whispers started the way they always do in a small town, with someone who thinks they're being discreet. Is that him? Thought he'd gone full ghost? That the woman staying out at his place? But Boone did not flinch, tipped his hat to Amos Griggs when the old man called out, "Glad to see you back among the living, Boone." And Rebecca walked beside him with the steady poise of a woman who has been stared at before and learned that a lifted chin costs nothing. Mrs. Tilly Grant, who presided over the pie table the way a general presides over a campaign, came straight up to Rebecca with sharp eyes and a warmer expression underneath them. "You must be the one we've been hearing about. The house up at High Hollows looked lived in lately." "I keep it warm," Rebecca said. "He keeps it standing." Tilly nodded slow. "Good trade. We could all use a bit more warmth." Across the lawn, a woman said something behind her gloved hand about the impropriety of the arrangement, about what decent people did and did not do. Her words were swallowed by the sound of Boone laughing, actually laughing, at something Elias Dunn said under a tree. The sound was rusty, real. Then the preacher's daughter, little Mary Beth, wandered up to Rebecca with a fistful of columbines, blue and yellow, held out the way children offer things, with their whole heart. "Mama says these are for pretty people," she said. "I think you're the prettiest here." Rebecca crouched down to her level. "Thank you, sweet girl. I'll keep them by the window." Boone saw it, all of it, the flowers, the child's face, Rebecca's expression as she accepted them, and when he spoke, it was not quietly. He spoke it where people could hear. "This is Rebecca Wynn. She keeps my house, and she kept me from going cold." After that, the whispers stopped. People passed plates and nodded and made room at the table, because a man who has been silent for years saying a thing like that out loud carries its own kind of weight. That night at the ranch, Rebecca placed the columbines in a tin pitcher on the windowsill, and for the first time since she had arrived, the house did not just hold silence. It held belonging. The weeks that followed were not peaceful in the way that means nothing happens. They were peaceful the way solid ground is peaceful. Things grew. Rebecca planted behind the house, columbines among the vegetables, crimson and yellow and white and blue, a small act of faith pressed into the earth. Boone found a bench he hadn't seen her carry out one evening, smooth juniper, sitting at the garden's edge. She hadn't asked him to make it. He hadn't told her he was going to. They sat on it in the evening sometimes, with tea he had taken to making himself, and did not speak much, but the silence between them by then was a different thing entirely from what it had been. Not a wound, not a wall. Just the quiet of two people who had run out of the need to perform. One morning he rode to Barlow's post for supplies and said he'd be back before dark came, full night, then the stars. Rebecca lit a lantern and set it in the window. Poured tea she didn't drink. Sat with Copper curled at her feet and watched the road. Just before midnight she saw a shape moving slow down the trail, one hand pressed to his ribs. She met him at the gate. "What happened?" Horse spooked on the return. His voice came through clenched teeth. "Threw me on the road." "You walked back?" He nodded. "Didn't think there was time to send for help." A pause. "Figured you might not still be here when I got back." She put her arm under his and got him inside, cleaned the wound, wrapped the ribs tight, made him drink the tea. Then she sat back and looked at him. "Why would I leave?" Boone stared at the fire a long moment. The flames reflected small in his eyes, because good things usually do. She sat beside him, took his hand in both of hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Boone. Not unless you ask me to." His fingers curled around hers. That was all. That was enough. Boone healed slower than he would have liked and faster than anyone expected. Rebecca changed the bandages morning and evening, heated broth, read poems aloud from the book he'd left on her pillow weeks before when the words didn't come. He hadn't asked her to read to him. She hadn't offered with words. It was simply understood, the way things between them had come to be understood, without announcement. One evening, warm enough now that the kitchen door could stay open onto the dusk, she went out to the garden bench and sat with her hands in her lap, watching the columbines she had planted sway a little in the evening air. Every one of them had taken crimson, white, yellow, the deep blue that reminded her of the dress she'd worn to Dry Creek. She heard Boone step on the porch, heard him come across the yard, careful still, but his gait steadier than it had been. He sat beside her without a word, and they stayed that way a while, watching the light change on the garden. Then he reached into his coat pocket. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Thick paper, creased at the edges like it had been handled many times before he decided. She opened it. The handwriting was his, uneven and deliberate, the way a man writes who does not write often but means every word. "There's no need to ask you to stay anymore. You already have. But if you'd let me, I'd like to make it proper, name and all." Rebecca looked up at him, and Boone, quiet Boone who had nearly let everything inside him turn to stone, cupped her face in hands that once only knew how to build fences and bury what he loved. He kissed her then, not like a man staking a claim, like one finally at great cost and long last coming home. They were married the following Sunday beneath the cottonwood behind the house, the same tree that stood over Clara's grave, and the small marker beside it. Reverend Ames came out from Dry Creek. Copper dozed in the grass nearby. There were no other witnesses needed. Rebecca wore her patched blue dress and the columbine brooch pinned close at her collar, the way she'd worn it the day they rode to the picnic, the day Boone had spoken her name out loud in front of people who needed to hear it. The brooch caught the morning light and held it. Boone had given it to her long before he had the words. But that day, the words and the brooch and the cottonwood and the man who stood before her were all saying the same thing. High Hollow Ranch did not become a different place that spring. It became more fully what it had always been trying to be. The windows stayed open. The kitchen fire held steady morning to night. Copper slept inside now, in a corner by the hearth that had somehow become his without anyone designating it. The drawer Rebecca had fixed no longer stuck. The bench in the garden had their names carved into the underside of the seat where only they would ever see them. On the wall of the parlor, where the light came in best in the afternoon, hung Clara's drawing, the two stick figures before the lopsided house with flowers out front. Boone had framed it himself and placed it there without commentary. Rebecca had seen him do it and said nothing. Some things don't need words. The columbines bloomed in rows behind the house, brave little things that pushed up through hard ground and turned their faces to whatever light was available. In some places they called the columbine the flower of faith, of hope, of love. Three things Rebecca Wynn had carried for a long time without anyone to help her carry them. She had planted them in the ground that spring not because she expected anything back. She had planted them because she finally had ground worth planting in, and on the bench outside where the evening light came just so, two people who had each been quieted by the world sat together without needing the world to understand it. The brooch on her collar, the calluses on his hands, the old dog between them. Some houses hold grief until it becomes the walls and the floorboards and the air itself. And then someone opens a window, lights the stove, sings a quiet song while kneading dough, and the house remembers it was built to hold something else entirely. High Hollow Ranch was not saved by documents or by love alone. It was saved by the small and dailiness of choosing. A fire lit before dawn. A pair of shoes left outside a door. A hand held out in the rain without asking for anything back. A woman who understood that you don't have to announce yourself to change everything. That is the kind of healing that doesn't come loudly. It just takes root and grows. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, The invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.